Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My guest today is Terry Menkens, a lifelong educator in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Terry, thanks very much for being on the programme today. You're from Australia, aren't you?
Absolutely.
So whereabouts in Australia, because it's a big place?
Well, I was born in Townsville in North Queensland in the middle of the Second World War, that was. And when I was about 5, we moved down to a little farm, a sugar farm in Home Hill, where my grandfather and uncle and my dad and all the family lived, shared houses on the farm.
So you're basically from a family of farmers then?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in Britain, our view of Australia, I think, has been skewed somewhat because, everyone watches Neighbours. But that's from a different part of Australia. So I think it is. Anyway, I'm not a great fan
Absolutely.
myself. But tell us, what's it like in Northern Queensland, or where you were brought up?
Well, tropical North Queensland is beautiful in as much as that you have wonderful contrasts of vegetation and climate throughout the year. You have your wet season, which is usually December and January, where you get a deluge of rain and thunderstorms, and also with that the insects, the mosquitoes and the beetles and the floods. And then very often you don't see rain for another 8 or 10 months for the rest of the year. But the environment in which I grew up on the farm was really very, very nice, in as much as that the farm was an unspoiled farm when I was young. 3/4 of the farm was covered with sugarcane, but there was a portion of the farm where wildlife could thrive. And my memories of my granddad's front garden, sitting on the veranda from his old farmhouse and looking into those pine trees, the Norfolk Island pines that had their branches sweeping up, and all way up the branches were little nests where the double bars and the bullfinches and the bloodfinches just colonised those trees. And there were all manner of little animals as well around the farm. And if you went down to the back of the farm where the dairy cattle were sent to graze, and we were often sent down to bring them home, you'd find wild ducks and jabberoos, that's the Australian stork, and ibises and cranes and koala bears even. That was a real highlight, to find a koala bear in one of our gum trees.
So koala bears are quite rare, are they?
They were then. They are more frequently found now because they have bred them up. They were quite endangered when I was a child, which is some time ago now.
Well, not too long. But it sounds like an idyllic childhood. You really enjoyed your childhood, didn't you?
Yes, we had ponies in the what we call the lagoon paddock just behind the house. And we used to ride old Tootles out onto the farm, and it was very nice.
Now, working on a farm or living on a farm, I guess you get involved in the work. So did you find yourself becoming involved in practical things quite early on?
Yes, I can remember very clearly being privileged to, I suppose they were short of labour, but it wouldn't be allowed today, but at the age of about 8 I was put on the tractor and said, now right, we're going to be putting the cane through the cane planter in the back, and you're going to just steer this tractor. And so they said, just watch straight ahead and fix your sights on a tree at the far end and stay straight. And I can remember one drill where I sort of looked back to see how I was doing behind, and when I looked around in the front, the evidence was in that crooked furrow. But it was great to be able to be given the man's job to do on the farm, and we drove tractors and rounded up the horses and helped in the dairy. And
sounds like every child's dream, really, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, to be in the barn playing amongst the great stacks of those Hessian sacks that were filled with bran and pollard, I think it was called, and these were additives that were brought in to put in with the chaff that was fed to the dairy cattle, and it quite often, in fact, we'd even bring in loads of pumpkins where the pumpkin crop was sort of superfluous to the needs, or the city prices had fallen, and you'd be put to work to cut up all the pumpkins for the cows.
And you enjoyed all of this?
It was wonderful, yes.
Now, your parents were Seventh-day Adventists, weren't they?
From when I was about 4, I believe it was, because I remember their baptism in the Ross River behind the city of Townsville. And as I recall it, it's very similar to what I imagine the John the Baptist's scene was like, because it was just the rocks and the water hole and a very raw place where my parents, I thought this was a strange event, what's happening here, but I appreciated it because the guidance that they passed on to me down through the years has been invaluable in shaping my standards and my life and my beliefs.
Now, there's an interesting lesson you talk about involving some construction, I think, because you started making things at an early age, didn't you? I think you made a boat, was it?
Yes, the Americans had left a packing case about the size of a bathtub, but in plywood. And quite often in school I tried to incorporate Christian values and thoughts into my lessons, as we are, admonished to do. And one that frequently comes up, and I think all of my students will have been exposed to this story and recognise it, but basically, in a nutshell, it was that my parents had advised me not to make a boat to go on the lagoon out of that packing case because it didn't have waterproof glue, it had furniture glue. Well, an 8-year-old boy realises that his father knows very little. And so on a Sunday when the farm was deserted, I had elected to stay home while everybody went visiting, and I had my own agenda. As soon as they were gone, I got that boat out and put a seat in it, made some paddles, dragged it down to the edge of the swamp and put it out onto the water and tested it. And there I was, absolutely right, Dad was wrong. It didn't sink. And so I set out and I thought, if I get a handful of water lilies and put them in a vase on the table for when my parents come home, they will be appeased and I will have my boat. Apparently it takes about a half an hour for non-waterproof glue or furniture glue to melt or dissolve. And I had been quite busy for nearly half an hour, and I was out in the middle of the lagoon, which was 12 or 14 feet deep and about 100 yards across, about the size of a football pitch. And I happened to spot on a tree that was growing in the swamp a yellow-belly black snake who decided to drop into the water and come my way just at that very moment. And I thought I'd better start paddling to the nearest shore about 50 yards away when I noticed that the water around the seams in the bottom of my boat, my tub, was starting to pour in. I looked back and the snake was still coming, and then the bottom just went out, and I swam like I've never swum before. Fortunately, I could swim. Made the bank, thinking in every moment that I was going to feel the bite of a snake on my toes, which I knew I well deserved. But no snake. He probably was more frightened than I was. And after a couple of hours in that hot sun, consoling myself, I dried out. Dad came home and wanted to know where the boat was, and no idea, Dad. But of course, in the tropics, as I told you, you get months of drought, and 6 months later, he called me down and said, "Terry, what is that in the bottom of the lagoon down there?" And sure enough, it was my hat and my Titanic. And of course, there's the story of the waterproof glue. Remember to use the right glue, but also remember that be sure your sins will find you out.
Yes.
And various other texts.
Now, it's an important lesson that you learned then. What was it that made you decide you wanted to be a teacher?
I think it was the values that my mother particularly encouraged me to. Her name was Ivy, a lovely lady, I loved her dearly, and my dad Gilbert. But they, I suppose, had ambitions for me because it was post-war and they had to struggle, of course, as many people did, to dig themselves out of the economic dearth after the war and to make way. And they hoped for something better for me, and they encouraged me to think about teaching or building. Now, when I went to high school, I thought, well, which way will I go? And I, at the age of about 15, wrote a little poem for the school magazine, which they, to my surprise, they published, and first time I've had anything published. So it was basically the thought of, do I want to build with bricks and timber and mortar, or will I build with lives, the standards and principles that my parents have taught me, and share that and make my building project? And I didn't get to go to Avondale, but I did get a chance to go to the Brisbane Teachers Training College and had 3 years of training, which that poem kind of expressed my thoughts, I think.
Now, Avondale is actually a Seventh-day Adventist college.
Further down south, yes.
But the one you went to was just a state one, was it?
That's right.
Yes.
Yes, a very good college.
After your teacher training, I understand you ended up back at your own primary school.
Yes, we were appointed back to Home Hill, which was quite nice to be back with family and friends, and the There were some challenges having several cousins in my class who liked to call me by my first name and do other things to embarrass me, but we got on famously, and I love them dearly, and we just look forward so much to having reunions. When I go back to Home Hill, we all gather at the farm and talk over memories of school days. And the funny thing is that my uncles taught my father and brothers and so forth, so teaching has been in the family for generations and still is.
Yes. Now, there's one more incident just from this period in Australia, and it involves another boat.
Oh, yes.
Because you got better at boat building, didn't you?
Yes, during this time of teaching in Home Hill, my brother was there teaching as well, and we built a Gwen 12 sailing boat out of whatever materials we could lay our hands on. In fact, the sail was made from an ex-army parachute of silk.
But this is a proper boat made from plans,
yes,
and everything.
With airtight compartments, made from plans, and 20-foot mast. Mm-hmm. It was a recognised designer, Gwen 12. We called it the Compass Rose, our pride and joy. And when we finished it, we sailed it up and down the coast to various places. But with my dad and my brother, Don, we decided to set out, with a few carrier pigeons on board as well, to the Palm Islands, which are about 39 miles from Townsville.
That's a long way.
It is, in open sea, by yourself in a 12-foot boat. I guess that's why Dad decided he should come. But, we started off well, but by late afternoon the wind had dropped and we weren't getting nowhere, but we spotted some islands nearby. We thought, we best put ashore here and stay there overnight and call it quits, and we'll go back home in the morning and forget about Palm Island, another 11 or 12 miles on. This we did, camped there overnight, and then the following morning we got up and stretched and went to explore, and we thought, this is a strange island. It seems to be pockmarked with great craters and bits of metal and various things, and lovely beach, mind you, and we had our breakfast, and then Dad called me over and said, hey, look at this. And it was a sign to say, this is a bombing target for the RAAF. That's the Royal Australian Air Force. Do not come ashore on this island. Well, fortunately that night they had desisted from any bombing practice, so we packed up pretty quickly and headed home. Released the carrier pigeons. They got home before we did.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, it sounds like you had a lot of interesting adventures. Just a little bit more about the wildlife and the terrain. I mean, when I think of Northern Queensland, I think of these television programmes with crocodiles and kangaroos. I mean, did you see these kind of animals around?
Yes, well, wallabies and kangaroos were in fact of plague proportions on our farm, and they did do a lot of damage because we relied on flood irrigation, where it was important that the drains didn't burst overnight. But of course, if you had these animals all lopping around in the water, and you can't blame them for wanting a drink, but they could do enormous damage to the farm crops. So yes, we were, I'm sorry to say, encouraged to cull these animals at a small price for the pest control man. And yes, I grew up with a rifle in my hand and made good use of it, along with the more challenging exploits of chasing or hunting crocodiles inland after we finished our A-levels, and we found a few of those too and terminated their angry lives. But nowadays I stick to shooting with my digital camera.
Yes, much safer for everyone.
In fact, it's illegal now to even kill a snake or a crocodile in Australia.
Yes. Well, thanks for telling us about that, because in our second half we're going to change the picture completely, because you left Australia, but we'll come on to that in just a couple of minutes.
Fine.
Well, Terry Menkens, we were talking before the break about your life in Australia, which sounded absolutely fantastic, but you decided you wanted to leave Australia.
Yes, I think it was probably the times I climbed the 40-foot windmills and looked out across those flatlands of the sugarcane fields and wondered what lay beyond. And, of course, my schooling and my culture had always harked back to the hollyhocked cottages, the thatched cottages of England, and the stories of England. And I looked on England as being the motherland. And I thought, because of the exposure I'd had there, plus the fact that with the jigsaw puzzles that my dad had brought me into while I was recovering from my appendix operation in hospital, the puzzles were of Buckingham Palace and Tower Bridge, And that just implanted a desire in my mind that one day I would go back and visit the mother country and see what it was all about.
So you decided to pull up your roots and go.
That's right. When I had finished my 3 years with the government, I was free then to do what I want with my life, and I thought I'll make the choice to apply to England and to British Columbia. And I had acceptances in both places, and I thought, well, England first. And I suppose also it was a very lonely life since when I was about 20. The nearest company to my age was a young girl of 12 and another lad of 31. I really was lacking on the sharing of my feelings and my thoughts and my experiences with people of my own age, because although we were in North Queensland, where there are a lot of Adventists, but we were in an isolated town about 70 or 80 miles from a big church.
And you kind of used the network of the Adventist church to travel, didn't you? Because you made arrangements with
That's right, independent transfers to start off with.
And you what year was it now that you left Australia?
December 63, so I arrived here, I think the 6th of January 64.
Now that was not a good time to come, was it?
Right in the middle of a real cold snap. I remember there were about 4 to 6 inches of ice on all the pavements down the Kingswood Road and off the Kingswood Estate, where in fact I now live, would you believe? And I walked there down those roads in the back of the park and met up with the Mallinson boys who worked at the press, and the press was still smouldering actually from that fire on the time I arrived.
Now this was the Stanborough press, the Seventh-day Adventist Church's printing press, which burnt down.
That's right, just that Christmas. And so the press moved north, but I stayed on at the school and had 2 years there. And when I started at the school, Harry Leonard was the publicity officer, and he interviewed me, and to my surprise, he titled the article that he sent to the Watford Observer, "Terry's No Bride Seeker."
Because you weren't married. You weren't married at this stage,
no.
were you?
Although I didn't think there was anything in it, he was quite correct in his prophecy, because 18 months later I was married to Jean Solomon, who was working right here downstairs below this studio, would you believe, in 1964 and 5. We married June 6, 1965. One of the smartest things I ever did. And together with my wonderful companion, we have then set off across to America for 2 years, again through the arrangements via the church connections. And I was head teacher of a school in Trenton. Went then, during the summer that followed that year, we drove right across the United States, because the idea was to spend 2 years while we were still young and freshly married.
Kind of working holiday, I suppose.
That's right. And across the United States through the prairies and the Rockies and the parks and the bears, and over into California, where they gave me a second teaching post for a year in Shafter, just outside Bakersfield. And from Bakersfield, there were so many wonderful things to do. Mexico, Grand Canyon, the Sierras, the redwood forests, and it was really a great time. We made some wonderful friends there too, which we still keep in touch with to this day.
Do you find then that this satisfied that longing that you'd first had at the top of that 40-foot windmill?
It sure did. Along with that, I should mention that my uncle and my granddad always got National Geographic magazines, and they were a godsend on those January days when you couldn't go outside because it was far too wet, and you stayed in and read books and looked at the world from the pages of those beautiful books.
But after America, you went back to Australia to settle down, didn't you?
That's right. Yes, we decided to have that's when we would start our family, and Fiona, and then Troy came along in Townsville, and we had 9 years there as I was head of the Townsville Adventist School, which I had helped to build. When we arrived there, it was just under construction, but I spent 4 months finishing off the cupboards and blackboards and things that it needed. And then in January we enrolled 36 students, filled in that register for the first time. Number 1 was Graham Syme, and then it grew up to 65 children when I left 9 years later. But 9 years later, we not only had that school, but we had a new school which the Commonwealth grants and the state grants had enabled us to build a lovely air-conditioned school, which I had to tear myself away from.
It must have been immensely satisfying to have done all this.
It was lovely. And at the same time as that, during those 9 years, I was not only head of the Home and School Committee, the school treasurer, with a lot of help from the conference treasurer, Harry Tresler. But I also did my further degree at the James Cook University, which was only a few miles away. So it was a case of putting in a school day and then dashing across to lectures and then doing assignments on the weekends when the children were wanting to go down the road to their beautiful Olympic swimming pool where everybody was having a wonderful time. And, Dad, can you hurry up and get your essay finished so we can get off and have a swim? But they were great years.
Again, it sounds great, but again, you didn't stay, did you? You decided to come back to beautiful England.
Yes. Well, Jean, my wife, her parents were still in Lowestoft, although they had been out to Australia for a few years, but they had returned to Lowestoft in England here, so it was time for me to consider transferring. So I decided to come over for a whole year together as a family and take a sabbatical, as it were. And I worked in Granos Foods as an engineer for a while, and that was great, building food processing machines. And then I was invited to start at Stanborough School, which, again, yes, by Derek Mason in 1978. But they said, Terry, we would like you to stay for at least 3 years because so many people have just flitted through. Well, that was 28 years ago, and I'm still here. So they've had their 3 years plus out of me at Stanborough School. And this year end, both Jean and I will make that magic 65, God willing, and at Christmas time we look to retire and hang up the chalk and start a new chapter.
Well, before you do that, we want to talk a little bit about this time that you've had at Stanborough, because so many years, 28 years in this one block. What was it that made you stay? Why did you stay beyond the 3 years at Stanborough School?
I think there are the attractions of the nature of this country. There are so many beautiful things to see and do, and I enjoyed the combination of subjects that I teach. As I mentioned earlier, I was always drawn to practical things. I'd like to have been a builder or an architect, but I guess I've vicariously fulfilled that desire through being a design and technology teacher and seeing all of the artefacts that have been really quality items that my students have made for their GCSE exams in the technology side of things. Maths, again, is a practical subject. I love that. And geography, again, too, is very practical, and it's just been a nice blend of subjects to teach. And we've lived quite near to the school, and Jean has worked down here at the VOP, the Discovery Centre now called. And it has just been a nice place to be able to serve God in that capacity.
You're very proud of the children, the pupils that you've taught at the school. You must get very attached to some of them.
Indeed, yes. When we have reunions and we meet up with past students and can laugh about the things that happened in the classrooms through the years, and also look back on the pictures of the things that they've made, or talk about the successes of the jobs that they're now in, or perhaps even like I did from a student back in Australia who became a doctor, and her mother wrote to say how much she appreciated the grounding I gave her through the 4 years I taught Joanne Castle's maths, and that she, the endorsement of the confidence of parents and appreciation. That's what really makes the rewards of teaching, I think. Apart from the smiles on the faces of students when they finish a task, and it is something they're really proud of because this is something that I made. This is for Mum for Mother's Day or Christmas, and it's personally signed by the student, or it's a nice piece of furniture that they take home and will keep in their homes forevermore, perhaps.
You mentioned earlier about the importance, at least as you see it, of including with your technical, lectures and teaching, moral teaching as well. What is it about Stanborough School and the Christian environment of Stanborough School do you feel that it gives it an edge, this Christian environment and the moral teaching that goes on there?
Well, I think that's what Seventh-day Adventist schools are all about. That is what makes them different. That is why so many hundreds of students travel past hundreds of other schools every morning and every evening to come to this particular school, because it offers something different. It offers them a preparation not only for this life but the life beyond. And that's not just a cliche. It is a reality. And I think in this society of today, that is a reality that is more and more in need of being grasped very firmly, because the pressures to draw students away into worldly and unhealthy practices is well and truly countered by Stanborough. Stanborough is doing wonderful things to fill the lives of our students with positive and happy experiences. And you just cannot imagine how nice it is when, you know, students do come and express and show their appreciation for the difference that we try to make in harmony and hand with God as our educator.
One other thing about Stanborough School, and we need to conclude, you spent your life travelling, well, a lot of your life has been travelling and thinking about travelling, living in Australia. In a way, the world has come to you in Stanborough School, hasn't it? Because it's a very multicultural school.
Yes.
Where have all these students come from, and why do they all come from all over the world?
Well, I guess it's because Stanborough School has a reputation, and it's a good one. The word gets out. Not only, does Stanborough School have these academic successes and high levels of achievement, it has lifestyle changes. And that's why the Adventist school system is one of the strongest parochial school systems on the earth. And it is disproportionate to the smaller population of Adventists, but education, of which I was so pleased I made that decision to become a part. And as I say, I'm looking back now on the closing of that particular chapter, because life does move on. But it's been a privilege to be part of that. And I know that when I thought about that poem of the builder, I chose the right kind of building.
Terry Menkens, thank you very much for speaking to us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.